Morality systems are fascinating, but flawed. Games that create morality systems tend to develop moral dichotomies. These dichotomies are typically something along the lines of good or evil, as in Fable, or hero and anti-hero, like in Mass Effect. Specifically in Mass Effect, these were called Paragon and Renegade. In Star Wars games and media, the light side of the Force and the dark side. This binary makes the gamification of moral decisions simpler by treating them basically as an either-or. However, if the intention of a gamified morality system is to create true moral dilemmas to present to the player, then they tend to fail on that front. Mass Effect is an example of this. Now let me be clear, I love Mass Effect, and it's one of my favorite games of all time. And I'm choosing it as an example because it's such a well-known touchstone for the topic. That being said, the morality system which drives some of the content doesn't truly reflect what it means to make real moral decisions. The way this system works is by gaining points into two different meters, one labeled Paragon and the other Renegade. Points are earned based on dialogue choices as well as certain actions. As the player levels up their Paragon meter, their character, Shepard, gains the ability to charm information out of NPCs. On the other hand, as the player levels up Renegade, Shepard gains the ability to intimidate. The problem is that once the player starts down one path, it becomes less likely they will want to deviate. Because of the abilities gained, the decision-making process becomes less of a choice and more of a foregone conclusion. Why would anyone choose something on a different track when doing so would detour them from their morality bonus? This is where these types of gamified morality systems show their flaws. They are huge endeavors, and I am not saying that they are bad or not worthwhile. They can be fun and increase replayability. In fact, the effort of even putting the idea of morality into a game is commendable, especially in a world where some games force the player down the path of violating the Geneva Convention like it's no big thing. In Mass Effect's case, numbers show that even when players can experiment with morality, 92% of players chose to play Paragon. This was according to former BioWare cinematic designer John Ebinger. So, if gamification does not work, then what does? The answer is simple. Suppose a developer is looking to give players moments to judge the morality of their actions. In that case, the choices cannot be opposites, but as far apart as possible, while remaining equally reasonable. As T.M. Scanlon said in his book, What We Owe to Each Other, thinking about right and wrong is, at the most basic level, thinking about what could be justified to others on grounds that they, if appropriately motivated, could not reasonably reject. By offering players two options, one being a choice that can be justified to others and another that clearly cannot be, players went with the former. But in situations where both options are born out of somewhat justifiable reasons, you will get more exciting variety in how players view their decisions' morality. So, what games do a neat job at narrowing the gap? Papers, Please was released in 2014 and has since become one of the most well-known indie games ever. The game is set in a fictional Soviet-style Eastern Bloc nation of Arcadology. The player acts as a border agent, responsible for checking the documentation of people crossing over into the border town of Grestin. Grestin has only recently been reclaimed by Arcadology after a brief war with the neighboring country of Kolechia. Your character has just won the job lottery and has been assigned this post. The primary gameplay loop works like this. You enter your booth, you read the rules for the day, open the gate, and begin checking people's documentation as they step up to your window. You then either accept their paperwork or reject it. At the end of the day, you are paid for each person you are able to process, and you make a choice about how to spend your money, either heating or food. If it sounds simple, that's because at its core, it is. Each day, the loop becomes more complex. Additional paperwork is added for the player to check. The paperwork begins to diverge between two paths, one for citizens and one for non-citizens. And also, there's the possibility that the rent might go up for the apartment, eating into the player's net income for the day and making a choice between food and heat more difficult. The brilliance of Papers, Please lies in the moral choices that you must make within the gameplay loop. On one of the days, a man who has his papers all together steps up to the window. He mentions that behind him is his wife. After stamping his passport, the man continues into Aristotka. His wife steps up, and it is immediately apparent. She does not have the required paperwork. There's a choice presented to the player, but it is not explicit. Stamp the wife's passport at the expense of being fined, thus putting your family at risk. Or deny her entrance and split a wife from her husband. There's no color coding or hint of renegade and paragon meters. What is the more moral choice here? These are the exact types of situations that moral philosophers were imagining when postulating the trolley problem. The trolley problem, a philosophical conundrum beyond meme or parody at this point, is still somewhat practical at illustrating the difficulty of weighing moral choices. Traditionally, it goes like this. A trolley is speeding down a track, which will eventually fork into two. If the trolley continues on its current path, it will hit 5 people. The listener is standing at a switch that will divert the train, but it will still kill 1 person on the new track. The problem is whether killing 1 person to save 5 outweighs the inaction of letting the trolley kill 5 people. The trolley problem is completely unrealistic. However, it still presents an example of a moral dilemma. In this specific instance, the player must weigh which choice is more reasonable than the other to get to the core of what is right or wrong. For example, the player may consider that the greater good is protecting the members of their family. However, if the player has been good at their job up until that point, they may only get a warning, meaning giving the free pass won't do any harm. Unless the player messes up again. As the opportunity to make a choice eventually passes and time moves on, the only person who is aware of that choice is the player. The consequences, potential fine or separating the wife and husband, are only left lingering in the player's mind. Several other choices can be made along the way in Papers, Please that push the player's judgment of what is right or wrong into question. Papers, Please developer Lucas Pope followed up this game with The Return of the Obra Dinn, which also contains some moral lessons, even though they are less noticeable. The Return of the Obra Dinn is set in the early 1800s. The player takes the role of an insurance adjuster investigating the return of the East India trade ship, the Obra Dinn, which has been missing for years. Upon arriving at the ship, the player opens a recently received parcel containing 2 items. One is a book with information about the ship. The second is a strange clock, which allows the player to view a person's exact time of death. The player sets about discovering each of the 60 crew members' fate. For each person, the player must fill out their name, cause of death, and who or what triggered the death. The last detail is where the gray areas come into play. Upon completing the game, the player is given an update on what the company paid out in insurance to each of the crew members' families. Now, some crew members were killed by accident, and if you are naive on the ending, you may list that the accident was caused by another crew member. It doesn't matter that it was unintentional. By recording the other crew member as the cause of the accident causer's family gets no insurance company payout. This did not sit well. After some investigation, I discovered that the player could change the way the fate is written, so that it is not clearly an accident at another crew member's hands. This spares the family the ignominious fate of losing a family member and not receiving the insurance payment that they are entitled to. There's a notable difference between how the 2 games handle morality. In Papers, Please, the result of the player's choice is evident from the approval of the would-be border crosser to the payout at day's end. There is only one point in The Return of the Obra Dinn where the player realizes the consequences of their choices at the end. Papers, Please is therefore much better at simulating the immediate pressure of making a choice based on what the player believes is right or wrong. Still, The Return of the Obra Dinn reinforces that the repercussions of choices may not be felt for a while and may also not be felt directly by the player. Either way, they demonstrate how moral decision-making is compromised by the constraints of acting within an institution like a government or company. When looking for games that force players to make a legitimate moral calculus, then both Papers, Please and The Return of the Obra Dinn are highly recommended. Beyond that, they are simply great games with solid gameplay loops that leave the player wanting more. Games, above almost all other media types, are perfectly positioned to let players interact with decisions of morality than any other. They can exhibit the trolley problem writ large across interesting and dynamic worlds with grounded and real characters. Experimenting with this may even help players understand themselves and the world around them better by sharpening their empathy. This is all very hopeful, but I can see how these systems and choices in games can have a memorable and lasting impact when delicately handled. I'm curious to see how game developers continue to tackle moral dilemmas in the future. What games do you think offer a unique experience regarding defining your character's own sense of morality? Let's talk about it in the comments down below. I'd like to thank my script editors, Kat from Pixel a Day, and Lee Keeler for helping me out today. Any sources, references, and other material can be found in the description below. If you're interested in my work, please subscribe and consider joining my Patreon. Thank you for watching. My name is Kevin, and you've been watching Arcadology.